founders and huge proponents of the group. I'm here today with Sengdo Lee and Hisham and Vikram and myself, Christopher. But we were kind of just talking a little bit about, from our last conversation in AI, the idea of biases comes up in every conversation. But it's so timely because Hisham and I got into a conversation a while back around the whole uh, Black Lives Matter movement that we're seeing all over the United States and all over the world currently, and just kind of the crossover between what we're seeing in biases with AI and how that's being programmed and how reflective it is. What was the word? How would you describe it? You said it very well when we had our conversation. It's almost like it is a reflection, right, of what humans do and the systemic biases that are underlying, right?
Yeah, I like to call it more like inherited AI bias because it's inherited from the human bias. Because when we say like an AI bias, it sounds like it is conscious bias, but AI is not conscious yet, not yet, at least. So all the biases that we see in AI is actually inherited from human biases.
Or a lot of times the intention isn't to be biased, but sometimes it goes through.
Yeah, whether it's intentional or not, it's inherited from AI, but it's from humans. Whether those humans intentionally put the bias or not, the AI bias is, I see it's not inaccurate because it makes it be blamed on AI, which is, I think it should be mostly blamed on the humans who either program that AI or put the data in that AI. So that's the idea.
Yeah. Well, one thing that, one of my very, 'cause I'm not the biggest tech person by any means, and Vikram knows this. I have kind of just a more outside way of looking at things in a holistic perspective. And I remember one of our first conversations I had with Vikram, and the idea that, really AI isn't good or bad. It's very neutral, right? It's how people use it or whatever, or the data that it has. So if you put bad data in, right, what you get out is not always good. But then you also made another point because one thing that you said that was interesting is like, okay, well, so it takes things from just data that's out there, right, and the information that it's accumulating to make its decisions or whatever it might be that might be more biased. So if biases exist in the data, it's going to be reflective. But then we talked about how do we catch that, right? And then you mentioned about bringing humans into the picture, and you brought up a very good. Yeah, would you like to share with us kind of your idea of like how to kind of curtail that?
Talking to me or to Vikram?
No, to you.
Oh, okay. Because
Yeah.
you mentioned Vikram at the beginning, yeah. But again, like we said last time, AI is not supposed to make decisions for human beings. AI is supposed to be as any other tool to help us see or to analyze things faster, of course, to give some predictions based on the data that we put, and to help us make decisions faster and more accurate. Depends on, of course, how do you define accuracy, but this is how is it supposed to be. It was not supposed to take decisions. Again, I'm saying this, AI is not conscious, and it is not emotional. It does not include any human affection or emotion, so that we would say like, oh yeah, so this is the final decision. It's supposed to be helping us to make decisions, not to make those decisions. So it is always good to have diversity, even for the people who are programming these AI solutions or overseeing the data that this AI. We need diversity in data science as well, because most of the data that comes from AI or the decisions or prediction are coming from data. And if this data, as you said, crap in, crap out, right? If you put crappy data, then you get crappy, results. This is how it is. AI is not going to think for you, and it's not going to correct your own mistakes. It is supposedly that it takes it in like a by default that what you get into it is the data that I'm dealing with. It's whether accurate or not, it doesn't care. I'm going to rely on it in this. So without human intervention before we feed the data and after we get the suggestions or predictions from AI to filter those predictions and to put our human concept and context, it's just another analytical tool that.
Yeah, and one thing that you brought up too is kind of interesting. Is like, like look at who predominantly is hired for some of these jobs, right? It's predominantly a white male, younger white male person who comes from college, from these
Right?
higher universities that get a lot of these programming jobs, and they might not be as sensitive to look for certain things, right? Like, there was the we had a conversation about the Google, when you put in, white man stole my car, right? And this was back in 2007. Well, Google would ask, did you mean, did a black man steal my car, right? So then how do you catch those things? Well, if you had diversity of the people who have their eyes on this, maybe that would have gotten caught because they might have been more sensitive, because as humans, we don't always see things because it's not on our radar. So I thought it was a very good a thought about, how do we bring diversity into the human element of AI development, which will hopefully translate into the development of AI and the output as well, right? To make that a little bit more, um, uh, just to kind of catch some of these things that are getting overlooked.
Yeah, and you remember when we talked about the AI was recognizing hands, the sensor
Mhm.
for in the sink, so that when it sees hands under the sink, it would only put water, because there was a problem that sometimes people forget, like what do you call, Pampers or anything in the sink, and the sensor, because it sees something under the water, comes in and out, comes out all the time. So they have this did that it only the system that lets water pour in only if it's hands. But it didn't work on black people's hands and even women hands, black or white. You remember that when we talked about it? And if you
Yeah,
remember that when they said that this was not intentional, maybe mostly because this was a smaller company that used to do that, maybe a startup or something, and they maybe trained them on the hands of the employees who had, which would be majority white males, and they didn't think about, because to us as people, it's a no-brainer that this is the shape of the hand. We don't think that there's an actually difference between a woman's hand and a male's hand, or between a light skin hand and a dark skin hand, right? To us, it's a
yeah,
no-brainer, because our eyes are being trained on seeing these things, even when we didn't know it, since the first 5 years of our lives, which we don't remember. But everything is stored, the shapes of different hands, the shape of different faces, and all. Well, this is not something that we should say it's a no-brainer to the AI. We should train it on the things, because it's in our subconscious, something that we don't see. It's a
yeah.
no-brainer to us that we should learn from our experiences, that not to take anything for granted when we deal with AI. Nothing is a no-brainer to an AI. We should deal with an AI like a kid, and we have to raise it from birth.
Yeah, but it's also understandable.
Yeah.
This is part of one of my conversations when we were, because I was hosting the panel on the Black Lives Matter with the actual human. It's hard because people don't know what they don't know. They don't know what to look for. It's not on their radar. One thing that I think is always hard for us for the white community. The few mistakes that I see the white community make a lot of times is to say, well, hey, you know what? I know what you're thinking, because no one can. Like, I'm sorry, no matter how much, like, I was married for 13 years. I still don't understand women, right? Because I just can't. What they go through, I just don't understand. And it's the same. And the other part of that too is to be open and understand that there's no way we can always understand the perspectives of certain things. So to have that kind of openness and to be almost embracing that we don't know what we don't know when we go into some of these roles, and hopefully open our mindset to look for these things that we don't even know what to look for, right? Or then how do we maybe even develop AI to help us identify what we're not knowing that we need to be looking for? Is that something that can be done on another level? And then the other thing too is not being defensive, when we talk. And I think that's another thing too, is like sometimes we can be prideful in our development, that we don't allow ourselves the objectivity to be aware. And then it goes, and then I think it's just so much. It's so interesting. I think it's why so often our conversations between AI overlap with our theologies and ethics. And I think even in this last show that we're doing was faith was brought in. What do you think, Singdo? Any thoughts?
Uh, yeah. I kind of want to take the biases in AI to even another complicated level that could make our heads explode. That's beyond our control at the moment. Um, so, Hisham, yes, back to you. Agree with Chris and everyone that I like that clarity that bias in AI is inherited. Simply AI or still deep learning is still an automation engine. Its output is still based on the input of the human driving this automation engine. So in the US, because the majority is white, the engineers are typically going to be white. Now, here's what I meant by making our heads explode. All countries around the world who have the time and energy and resource to develop AI, their majorities within their country will be designing what goes in and what comes out, so that all AI engines from around the world will have its own
Biases.
drastic biases.
Yeah.
That I feel like in the future, how do you make this kind of more universal? Is the everyone needs to share a common AI database to be accurate with each other. Is kind of what inspired from this conversation.
Well, it's kind of like this idea of a collective mind of AI as well, right? The whole beautiful thing about, the Internet of Things, for instance, is that, the capabilities to have AI learn from all these different regions is definitely there. Now, whether countries want to share that information, completely different story, I'm sure.
Right.
Um,
Some countries wouldn't. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, but you would think that, that would be a great way to kind of help get past some of these biases because, you're bringing perspectives in from other countries or other regions where they're developed by different individuals. But then you also look at who's also driving some of these projects as well. Sometimes like who are the companies? Where are they held? Um, you know, yeah, it's just. But how do we how do we start to bring that information to one collective source? I don't know. I mean, that's why we have our group, right? I guess.
Mhm. Yeah. We're
I,
kind of
you
being
know,
futurists right here, but it is coming. Some type of organization, maybe like the good AI, needs to be a governing international seal of stamp saying, hey, this database and your database and others' database is willing to share. Let's do some data scrubbing and get accurate with each other so that we try to remove as many biases as possible would be the dream. But yeah, there's going to be plenty countries that don't want to share. But to simplify it, this we could just look at this as like an international malware antivirus database, but it's for AI. Would be the same ask. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I
Well,
think the counter is that who has access to this, right? they, and what kind of intentions they have. Uh,
The intention, yeah, that's the
they,
danger.
they might
well, let
be.
me let me throw something out there for you guys because you guys will know better than I will, right? So, from a very layman perspective, one thing that we're looking at is predictive AI. One thing we're looking at is like, we don't know what the jobs of the future are going to look like because we know AI is going to be shifting the whole entire workforce. So we don't know what the jobs are in the future are looking like, but we're trying to find ways of using AI to determine that, right? How can we use AI to find out what those jobs are? Because we don't know what we're going to know, but can we use the predictive modeling to do that? Is there a way to maybe use the predictive modeling to determine, hey, how do we preemptively catch biases? Is there a way of doing that maybe? At least put something on our radar to help us out in this space of biases?
Yeah.
Or
So just on the bias itself, Chris, the answer is no because there is no way to catch bias because what are you going to use as a baseline, right? If what if that is bias, right? So there is
yeah,
just way to catch bias itself. What you can do is be fair, like have measures to be fair. I mean, I'm so glad in the last few weeks I've been, every week I've met someone or the other from these large, massive enterprises. What the requirement they're talking about is that we know that people are, sometimes talking about a certain issue, and we don't want our platform to, just because a lot of people are talking about it, to encourage that. We want to actually have a counterbalance. If a lot of people are talking about Democrats at the best. I want to bring up the Republicans are also awesome, right? That view so that it's neutral and people get a fair chance to choose. So these are the kind of things that larger companies or you really who care about what do they want to stand for, right? And how just law of large numbers should not suppress a voice which doesn't have yet enough backing, or so sometimes a lot of data can encourage bias, racism, all kinds of things that maybe people don't want. And then it's encouraging to see enterprises asking, how can we make our searches very neutral, right? There is instead of suppressing content, we'll just suppress the searchability of the content and make bias, introduce bias to actually counterbalance two different opinions. It's just fascinating to see how large companies are already thinking about this stuff. So that can be done, but data itself being used to catch bias on its own, it's very hard. Because there has to be some neutral opinion, and somebody has to say this is neutral, this is not. And at the moment you do that, again, there is some amount of bias, whoever is doing that. So you can be fair, you can be transparent, you can have privacy at a very high level, and so it has to be broken down into smaller steps or chunks. It is unfortunately very difficult to just remove bias from anything. It's just not possible.
Well, yeah, you always say it from the get-go. You'll never get rid of biases. And I think it's very much on the human level too, right? But then, like, let's say, for instance, you want to add balance. And then it goes back to this question of, we don't know what we don't know. So let's say you have a Republican side and a Democratic side. So if you have weight going over this way, how do we at least balance it out, perhaps? But then what if there's a third party? Does that get lost in the mix? Does that get captured? So that, if you have like an XY axis and you have something on the far top left corner, something on the far bottom right, there's probably things that exist on these other two quadrants that might not be on the radar. So then how do you make sure that those get part of the balanced equation as well? What if there's a party that we're not really seeing, but there's an uprising for? And it adds to the complexity, right, to what you're talking about. And maybe one of the reasons why we're not going to be able to maybe get there. But then again, with AI, is there a way of utilizing that to try to capture more of that? There are things that you go out there and look for new ideas, and it's a little bit more proactive and try to bring that into the equation to make sure that has a voice, perhaps.
Well, let me tell you one thing on that. The problem with bias is it's invisible. Like I'll give you an example of a human bias, because again, bias is inherited by humans. Like, a couple of years ago, they've done a study in the United States, and 80%, I think, of the people who are, it's wide variety on all states in the United States, and they say 80% of the people who had that survey said they have never met a Muslim in their whole lives, never. And when someone, I think it's even on YouTube. I don't know. I don't remember when I watched it. It was in an event or on YouTube. One filmmaker decided to go to one of those cities that were high rate of people who saying they never met a Muslim. I think it's in Texas or somewhere. And when he looked at people and done a research, and he told some people, did you know that a lot of the taxi drivers that you went on were Muslim? And they were in different skin colors because they came from a different pit. Do you know that some of your doctors that you went to the hospital and you were cured by, or they took care of you, doctors or nurses or something like that, were Muslim? Did you know that the shopkeeper in the store that you go in every day is a Muslim? It is now. See, but those people who answered, they've never met a Muslim in their lives, and either because one of those reasons. They never thought that they're dealing with a Muslim guy because they never asked, which is, it's not bad, but it's also it doesn't tell, because they never. We take those people like people like this for granted. We don't even try to get to know them or say like good morning, something like that, and maybe notice something or from somewhere, something like that. We don't start conversation like this, and we take things for granted. And it's not because these people are bad or biased. I mean, that this is because this is how invisible bias is. They didn't think that this person in front of them, or the doctor who was who treated them, or the taxi driver who took them wherever they wanted to, belongs to a different religion. So this is very, and I'm saying it's not because they don't care, or they don't want to see a Muslim or something. Some of them just didn't ask. It didn't came to their mind that I didn't ask, so I've never met a Muslim in my life. But they're in their lives every day, and this is what makes discovering bias so difficult, because it's so invisible.
So let me ask you this. So I completely agree. And I always say racism or privilege. Privilege is a very invisible disease, right? People don't see the privileges that they have because it's not on the radar, and they don't see the other side that they don't understand. But then I have a question, because maybe it's not about removing biases, because I think maybe some focus is like, how do we get rid of biases? Maybe the focus is recognizing biases, like being more aware of them, like something like what Vikram said. I always talk about this idea of a reticular activator. It's something that when it's on your mind, you start to see things more frequently, right? Like when you buy a new car, let's say you decide, hey, I'm going to buy a Honda Accord, and you go to the dealership, you spend all day, test driving a Honda Accord, you sit there in the office, you drive one, right? So you sit there and you wash it. Once you drive off that lot, it seems like half the cars you see are Honda Accords now. They're everywhere, and you didn't pay attention to it before. To me, I kind of see the same thing with biases. But like, if we're not removing biases, same thing with prejudices. It's being aware of your biases first and foremost. If you're not aware, that's probably where some of these things problem. So now let's say if we shift our conversation, instead of removing biases to recognizing biases, does that get us to a better point, do you think?
Exactly. One of the things that I also tell the stories is like, I was there was a time that I was having a project, and I go to a specific bus, and there was this young lady, like Generation Z or something, who was sitting all the time at the same time that I go with the bus, and she's always having headphones and something to play with. And I was always, because she's a young, I think of myself as someone who's very least biased, because I'm open-minded, and I always look to be open-minded. But when I was looking at this girl, I said, like, this generation, young guys, they always have music. They don't want to hear the world around them and all of this thing. And I submitted, at the time, I submitted to a cultural bias, that young guys don't care about anything. They just put this music in their heads and listen. But one time she sat next to me, and I couldn't help myself to look at what is she playing. And she was actually playing an audiobook. One of my favorite audiobooks, which is Dan Brown's Origin. And I looked at it, and I then realized two things. I said, like, after all, maybe we're not too different. We belong to two different generations. We have a lot. But this is the way that those guys read books now. I still like to read their textbooks and all. I am a digital guy, but I still like that. And I think this is a generational thing, because we used to do that. But this is the way they read books. And I realized that I was biased with my, with my judgment on her. But the fact that I think I cannot eliminate biases in myself, but the fact that I know that I can feel them, and I can admit them to myself, and I say I was stupidly biased against this girl because I submitted to a cultural bias, and I couldn't, and I shouldn't. Now, when I look at anyone of her generation, and unless I hear like loud music coming out, I would never, assume that they're listening to loud music and they don't care about anything, because I realize that, I recognize my bias, and I'm not going to do that again. So I believe what we should aim to do is, as you said, try to recognize biases and do them step by step, baby steps. When we recognize the bias, and this would not happen if we don't diversify. Like, I didn't know that I'm biased against this generation until I saw this girl, and I saw that she was reading one of my favorite books in her own way. So I now know, because I got closer into that. So when you diverse the people who work, and you realize their habits, their cultures, their their ways of thinking, there is no way that we can eliminate bias. We should diversify.
And just even listening too, like, it also seems like there's a very thin line, a very, very fine line between biases and then also maybe patterns.
Yes.
Because part of what you're looking for when you're doing and using artificial intelligence, you're probably looking for patterns in many cases, right? So then, what's the difference between a pattern and a bias? Like, is there, or how would you define that? Maybe Vikram, you. I always like to be Vikram in any conversation that has to do with biases, and his answer is always the same. We're never going to get rid of biases; they're always going to exist. But
No,
then,
see, pattern in itself is just a trend, right? I mean, it doesn't have it's somebody who's looking at that occurrence and saying, okay, it's good or bad, right? So that is the fundamental difference. So pattern is just some sort of trend, some observation, right? Right. That's how I see it, and it's something that mathematically, if you look at it, right, patterns sometimes are repeating, sometimes they're non-repeating as well. But the patterns which are repeating, the good thing is you can predict what's going to happen, right? Non-predicting or one-off, like there are patterns which you can't replicate. So then, should you call them patterns in the first place, right? Or is it just a one-off? So this
then is it a pattern?
different, right? Bias is a totally different thing. Bias is your opinion of that situation. That eating at night or running after eating food is good or bad. That's just sometimes it's opinion, sometimes it's proven with some data facts, and sometimes just that's the only way things.
But could patterns be based off of some biases, right?
You can try to relate, but it's you who will join the dots, and it's whatever is in your head becomes by definition good or bad, right? Killing people is bad, but if you're in army, is it good or bad, right? If you're a terrorist, is it good or bad? There's just the perspective will change completely, right? Based on who you are. But killing people is bad, right? If that's the only pattern you see is that that's bad, then can you justify any army in the world? Can you justify any terrorist, right? Like, who's bad, who's good here? So it's a matter of perspective. But if you objectify, okay, no, I'm only going to look at the activity at an granular activity level and say, okay, is that right or wrong thing? Again, it's what so you tell yourself that is bad. But then the same thing happens in another situation which you justify for yourself, right? Calling it protection, security, or whatever, right? Defense. You can justify the same thing, which inherently, by definition, is not a right thing.
So if we start bringing in other regions, like Sangdo Lee was talking about, right, or we bring in more diversity, as though Hisham was discussing, does that start to help define that or make it more broad? I mean, like, because again, then it's subjective. Who's determining whether that's good or bad? And if you only have one perspective making that determining factor, right? Then so when we bring some diversity, you have three people who might not feel that it's as black and white.
Yeah.
You bring a soldier in there. You bring somebody, from a non, war mentality or whatever, or someone from a different region who says, okay, well, what exactly is terrorism? Are you the terrorist or are we the terrorist? Then you start having a different conversation. I think that's going to be very important. But then that also slows down the process too. I think that's anyone who's working with AI, a lot of times, like, hey, how quickly can we get to our point of destination? Are we willing to slow down and bring some of these other perspectives in and make sure that we're doing it the right way? So many different factors to be considered.
Yeah. I mean, it is opinionative. I mean, I don't know, Sangdo, if you have a view, but mostly when you think about broader things, right, the things that are of a longer term, right, say 500,000 year type terms, right? Is the definition of good? It's something that remains good for a long time. Is that the definition people should take? Like, for example, faith, right? We have this AI and faith as a topic here. So faith has been straight line for a very long time, right? So is faith then defining good or bad? Is that the right way to do it? Because the length of time that faith or religion or books that define what is right for that specific community, for that specific religion, and it's widely accepted, and it's been accepted for many, many hundreds of years, is that then the definition of defining good or bad? Or is it something that is good in the short term but no care, don't care about long term. Stando, any opinions?
Yeah. My gut feeling says the earliest solution to this problem might take 100 years. In the now, we're defining what's good and bad and bias, and every country will get to a point where maybe 51%, 49% type margins of you know closeness will say generally we feel this is non-biased, and every country will kind of come to that conclusion with every action and thought or belief. And this is a super deep database that I don't even know, if we can even achieve each country in 100 years, because there's still 200 plus countries and nations, and not everyone's in the AI yet. But what I'm getting at is, it's almost like each country and nation who has AI definitions um, sort of have like a glossary or style guide of, in our country, we don't believe this is bias, or we do believe that's bias, and then converge it with all the different databases and definitions from around the world. And in the future, the end user can decide, hey, in a scenario like this or a pattern like this, and I want to put in the flavor of Iran, or I want to put in the filter of U.S., and people can quickly see what different people from around different regions might see as good or bad. Um, so you have that option of the majority feel, and then you can also turn off maybe those filters so that you can kind of make the judgment yourself. But I think that's the only way we can kind of get to the most like non-bias. But you guys are all right. Absolutely, bias is impossible to remove. So because it's impossible to remove, we have to give the transparency and the option to each end user. You know, this group, this political party, this country, we find this bias and non-bias. And you decide. You choose your own like interpretation would be the most fairest, because bias is impossible to remove because we're human.
And then also AI is reflective of what the data that humans put in there as well, right? And we're
Mm-hmm.
also limited by the person developing the AI, which is also a human factor right now as well. And then you
Yeah,
also bring
sky's
up
the
another.
limit.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it's just, it seems like this, and then you add another layer on top of that, because then you start looking at, okay, now we have this duration of time into the equation, right? Because now you have different things that are going to change over time. The idea of what's right and what's wrong could change over time. But then we look at, how do we audit this? How often do we audit it? Is that part of the process now too? Right? It's
Yeah, I mean, so for example, simple thing, we're still at this point at least isolated in one planet, but so nuking another country is bad, but nuking something in the space which is trying to hit us, right? That might be justified, right? So you might not justify an event or an activity in one situation, but can totally justify in another, right? So there
yeah.
is also that element, right? That you think nuking anyone is bad, but then something is about to hit us, and we nuke that thing. Everybody's like, okay, yes, we got to do that. Unanimously, everybody agrees, no, we don't want that thing to come near us, right? So when do you decide then? Or who decides is the question here, right? Like, how can you justify the same activity in two different ways? And that's the level of difficulty here that we're dealing with when you think about this topic broadly, right? First of all, there's a question of time. That something in the beginning of time was not okay, but then it's okay, and now it's not okay, and then it's okay again. So how do you? So there is something that will change over time, So our opinion whether that's good or bad can change, right? Like even talk about food, eating carbs is good, and then it is bad, and then it's good again, and so.
No, it's always bad. It's always bad. I have gained
Yeah.
10 pounds during COVID. I'm telling you, carbs are always bad.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so it's hard to like again pinpoint that okay, this is exactly the situation, because there is time factor, there is perspective factor, and like I said, we are now producing a lot of data now. What if something is not producing enough data but is um, a system that could be leveraging data, but it's not. And then there is certain perspective or bias that's already there, which is not being considered anywhere else. And with interdependency of systems, there is something adversely that can affect either that industry, that the specific community, or data set, whatever that equation might be. Uh, it is, I mean, for example, church is thinking about uh, who should have, who should be a human. That is a question that they're like when machines, like people have artificial limbs, artificial hearts, like 3D printed stuff, like body parts, right, that are working as intended. And at some point, there could be the other way where human brain is injected into a machine, or like what Elon Musk is trying, opposite of that. So at what point they should be ready? So they're trying to think about how do we prepare ourselves, right? Who gets to be in the church? Who's creation of God, right? Something that live. What is the definition of a living being in that sense, right? One that walks, moves on its own, thinks autonomously. What are the different criteria, right?
It's funny when I hear saying though talk about like we might not even land on the most basic first definition of good or bad for another 100 years, right? It kind of reminds me of our very first conversation. When we first decided to talk about the good AI, it was like you, Vikram, myself, and then we had Sanjay sitting at the T-Mobile headquarters.
Tango, by the way.
Yeah, but it was so interesting because one of the first things he said is like we have to realize when we look at not just AI but all of these technologies like Internet of Things, and we are at the prehistoric stages, and it's crazy that as far along as we think we might be, we're such at the infancy stage of the development of AI, and so we have to have a very very far. That's why I like having these conversations and having these discussions because if we let the reins go, even for the first little bit, who knows what direction it could go, and how soon do we need to audit and having these conversations to at least address some of these ideas. But then, you look at, again, you talk about, how much data do we have? And one thing we talk about is like when we talk about good AI, is good AI ethical AI and doing the right thing? Or is good AI quality of AI, which means less biases and more data because you have to have more data. So then if we have, a more diverse group of people, does that, or more regions and more countries involved in that, we get more data. Does that then make it better, from a quality standpoint? Yeah, any thoughts out there?
I just want to go a little bit back, but it's also related to what he said. Like when Vikram was talking about the idea of good and bad, and it's okay if we nuke someone because they're they're bad people and they're affecting us and all things. There's to some cases we can think about it as also cause and effect. Like let's say we want to nuke people, but we know right now it's like nuking people is not just about killing them. We're still having bad climate change effects because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the hole in ozone that it was responsible for, or Chernobyl when it was a worse effect because of that thing was happening. Although that was to you guys our enemy, because it was at that time it was the Soviet Union. So, but when it came. Many European countries at that time, and this is amazing, they came to help because even though they were not having that nice relationship with the Soviet Union, they were all in this together. If that thing went on and on, the whole European what do you call it continent is going to be wiped out of life. So when we think about things, I say like, okay, so I'm biased against them. So maybe the first step to try and eliminate the major biases is think about it from a cause and effect. So I hate these people maybe, and I think they are dangerous to me, whether right or wrong. Is it okay to nuke them because I'm affecting myself doing that? So the thing that I'm doing is not just it's not going to just protect me. It's going to affect me at the end of the day. All of these nuclear radiations and all of this thing going to affect the environment. We know that for sure. From all of these things. The other thing is, look at it from a different point of view. Let's not talk about nuke. everybody looked at what happened in Syria and they would say like, this is not our problem. It's a civil war. No one wants to go. Now we see, because of that, those millions and millions of refugees are leaving the country and putting a lot of pressure on
And the rest of the countries around it.
the whole world now is having a pressure, specifically Europe, around countries like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and all of this thing. And now with the blast that happened in Lebanon, there are a lot of Syrian refugees who came as refugees because they were having blasts in Syria. Some of them died in another blast. So we see that this is happening. We know now that whether I like those people or not, or whatever I think about them, whatever bad things happening there is going to affect me at the end of the day. So it is not, if we started that culture that we learn from these lessons, that it doesn't matter. If there's some problem in the world, I see the world as a human body, like if your hand is really hurting you, you cannot just say, "Oh, it's just my hand. Everybody else in my body works fine. I can just ignore it and continue with my life." But that's not what happens. You go to the doctor if your hand is aching, or if your leg is aching. Even if it's like your one finger is aching, you want to go to the doctor, right?
But like the analogy that Vikram said, Vikram made the comments like, again, does that ever change, right? Because we can say that right now. We all understand that we can say right now nuclear weapons are horrible, right? But then there's a movie that came out a while ago called Independence Day. I don't know if you've ever seen it. But then the aliens come from another planet, right? Then, and now I'm going to go Sengdo in a second too, because I'll blow your mind like he always does. But let's say, at that moment we determine, right, that wow, there's a whole nother alien race, and I'm not, I'm just speculating, but this kind of goes back to the whole point of we don't know what we don't know, right? So now, what determination do we make at that point when also we say, hey, there's another group of aliens coming, right? But then, go ahead.
Yeah, the point is more of like we are justifying the act in one situation and saying it's good, and another situation the same act we're saying it's not good. So but then the fundamental question is who's deciding. That's my question. That's nothing else. It's whatever if that same activity you're doing here and you're saying it's okay, and then when that activity happens again in another situation you're saying it's not okay. So
but I think but we have to be open to look at different scenarios in that real time as well, right? Because again, that goes back to the audit. Because if we make a determination and we're not willing to say, okay, let's be open, because it's not just who's making that decision; it's what information do they have at the time to make that decision as well. Because again, when you add that time factor, because then we can sit there and say, okay, well, it's the aliens, so we can definitely defend ourselves. But then, what if the aliens were just like when the Americans came over? And how did the Native Americans feel when the Americans came over? Maybe the aliens, but then we don't know about that. I mean, that's the whole mind-blowing part that I was going to talk about, saying though. It's all about perspectives because, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, but then, so to your point, right? When you're making a determination based on some data, the question is, do you have all of that data, and is that data biased? I mean, how would you know? How would you know there is another perspective, another opinion? Because at the time you're only looking at maybe not the full picture. And at the time, when whatever happened, somebody was able to justify that act and, nuking some country. And in retrospect, they're like, okay, it was a terrible idea, should have never happened, right? But then, the question is that, are you overlooking some data? Are you really looking at the whole perspective, the full picture, or just trying to justify, okay, I'm taking a decision, what data do I need to justify this? Let's just bring that and leave everything out. Yes. And then if that's how most people are making decisions today, leveraging AI, this is a decision I've decided I need to make. Now help me justify this. Bring the data to justify this decision that I've already taken.
But then they're going to be biased on what data they bring in as well.
Yeah, I'm going to try to bring this all home. It's super complicated.
As if anything that we're talking about is not complicated.
Yeah, no, it isn't. So let's see. I think it's safe to say all philosophies, religion don't encourage proactive killing, and it says, more coaches you to, don't kill unless you have to. But if you look at our own history, the human knee-jerk reaction is we don't really have to kill anything unless we, need to defend ourselves or need to eat an animal or whatever. Um, but it seems like the biggest decisions to, take out a country or, mass, air raid and bomb an area, ultimately, whether we like this truth or not, it's always like a business resource reason. Is why humans operate. Powerful countries and humans behind it operate the way they do and rule the world for resources and business reasons. It's always been that way for centuries. So that's what we know about humans and how we react and how we proactively kill to take in more resources. So going back to like maybe a comet hitting us or an alien on its way to attack us, I think we will attack mostly based on our knee-jerk reaction to kill something we don't know, especially if there's some type of valuable resources that we can gain from it. It will always be the motivation, but then from the spiritual perspective, once again, you shouldn't really destroy or kill anything if you don't have to. And that's like the bigger picture, the laws of the universe. That
Well,
most people don't care about.
one thing that I love, so I wanted to, kind of bring this back is, and because I don't want to get about the aliens and really about the nukes, because I think we could all agree that's not really the whole intention of what we're trying to look at, right? But but the idea, sorry, I need a drink. But the idea that I love what Hisham said. It's like, one thing we need to look at is the consequences, right? And so we look at the consequences, to help determine some of these things as far as what we know. And maybe we can only make the best decision that we can. But then I have to look at, again, the only reason why I brought the whole thing about the aliens back into the picture, though, is because, again, there's so many other perspectives that we're not seeing. And it goes back to the Vikram side of things. It's like, how do we consider things that we're not aware of? And everyone's got these different opinions. And at the end of the day, someone's going to make a decision on when it comes to the biases as far as how it's going to be used or whatever it might be. And then it goes back to the same dichotomy we started off when we had this first conversation as far as biases, right? So now we don't try to just necessarily eliminate them, but we want to recognize them. But when we recognize them, then how do we deal with them? Do we extract the most quantifiable information, which goes to Hisham's point? Let's take what we do know and use that data to be as responsible as we can, looking at the effects of the data. But then to take this Vikram standpoint too, it's like, but there's so much that we still will not see because, biases is invisible. So as much as we know, we have to recognize there's probably a vast majority of information we don't have still. And even though we bring in more data, where do we choose to bring that data in from? And then it goes back to, it's not as simple, right?
Yeah, and there's one thing that two quick points that to talk about to your point, Sango, that religions say don't kill until you need to, but the you have to is really not very clear in those rules because I've read a lot of them. Like in the Bible, specifically Leviticus, if a gay man slept with another gay man, then kill them both. So you didn't have to kill them both. They didn't do anything wrong to the society. They were just making a relationship, right? So why do I have to kill them if this is a reason that I have to kill two? I'm not defending myself from anything if I'm killing them. And even if you look at Islam, it's not in Quran, but some people say it's in Hadith, which is another major source for Muslims. And in a lot of religions, I mean, like when I even looked at the indigenous culture here in Canada, I was surprised to say that they were accepting homosexuality before all of these religions because to them they worship nature and they don't see anything in human. They don't see like physical disfigurement, which was in many centuries in Europe, if you were born in disfiguration, they would say this is demonic, this is something like that, and it's just like that's what we born. And if you are gay, then this is something wrong with you, and you're cursed by God. They they worship nature, and they think that nature doesn't make mistakes. It's the choice of nature to make these people disfigured, and they call people who are with like homosexuality or bisexuality, they call them the two-spirited guys. That they have a spirit of a male and a spirit of a female, and that's how nature created them. And it just amazes me how ancient cultures were more open-minded and more accepted, and they don't have any killing in their culture.
But what I also wonder though too is sometimes looking at how is these books of religion or whatever it might be on all courses, how are they translated? What was the intention of those initially? Was that lost in the mix? And I think again, even when we look at look at this, what it says is black and white. What don't we know about that culture or that time, or maybe was there something going on at that time that's what they thought, and I don't know, but it just goes back to. There's so many opportunities for error in every single area, right?
Yeah, but my point is every culture, and I'm not saying that the indigenous culture maybe that don't have their own biases, but my point is when if someone from a culture that has biases against gay people or against people who are different or whatever has get introduced to the indigenous culture, that might cancel them, which is why I'm saying diversity is a very good thing. Because here, look at our panel. We are 4 people here, but we all come from different races, from different cultures. We came with our own biases in this session, but I'm sure we have learned in this only like an hour, less than an hour. We've learned a lot about ourselves and about our things, and this might have canceled a lot of our biases only talking to each other right now. And this is maybe, and I will get back to your own to another point when you talk about aliens, because there's another TV show called V. If you saw that, there was an.
I'm not old enough to remember that TV show. That was way before my time.
No, there was a new one.
I remember the original one too, just so you know.
Yeah, I know. I saw that, but there was a remake of it, and the idea was totally different. The thing that aliens came in with looking like humans, and they said we come with a technology that will help you. We just have our planet is in danger and destroying itself, something like that, and we're looking for another home, and we want to live with you peacefully. And people submitted like very quickly. It's like, oh God, they have cures for our diseases and all of this thing, and the real intention for them was to occupy us and to control us. For example, that's science fiction, I know, but it shows us that our biases also could go when you say about aliens or people we don't know, because the word alien is not only extraterrestrial aliens. Aliens could be someone you don't know, and like a Mexican who lives.
Well, when you told the story about V, I could my first thing that goes through my mind was the first Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Right. How was that perceived, and what took place with the Native Americans? So I get what you're saying as a whole.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like when the alien is someone you don't know. It doesn't matter if it's an extraterrestrial or someone on your neighbor or just a few kilometers out from your home, but he looks different or something. So back to the point, I believe the only thing that will help us eliminate biases, will not just cancel all kinds of biases, but to eliminate is to get to know that alien.
Hey.
So then go back to Vikram. Vikram, what are your thoughts? Because take his scenario, but then he brought the idea around intentions and not knowing one's intentions. You hit it on that earlier today.
Yeah, I mean, point is that you might justify your intention in one scenario, and another one you can't justify the same intention in action, right? So I think, but all the point, that's the beauty of it, right? That's why you need diverse people in the room. That's why you have diversity in data and diversity in all the decision making. And I think the acknowledgement that this is a hard problem to solve is big. I think that's where the starting point is. If somebody feels it's an easy problem, I don't think they're solving the right one. I think most of the conversations, especially in the AI and faith community that we are having, they're solving a problem from 500 years from now. They're not solving the 2020 problem. They're not. Really, they're looking way ahead. Their horizons are much longer. Astronauts are solving probably longer time frame than that, right? Like, what is the speed of light? It is nothing. It's like some small ant crawling. What is 1 year in this universe, right? It is a tiny planet rotating around a tiny star. That is 1 year. When we say light year, this is the fastest thing we know and the longest time duration that we measure. These are smaller parameters when we think about a larger perspective. So it's just also, uh, those things need to be in this perspective. So point is that being aware is this, of the problem, that this is a complex one, is the starting point, and then looking at the right time frame to solve that problem. That, and then within that time, so do I want to solve this short term or long term, or for immediate gains or long term gains, or benefit of everyone or benefit of few people? There is just a lot of factors that one has to, I guess, take into account, and just that realization itself, I think it's a starting point. You won't get to the end state. Some of the things like religion will not figure out how to bring AI into the mainstream for many, many years, right? All the religions will struggle, and the ones that want to be relevant, right, and give hope, right, that's to a machine or a human equally, right. There is work to be done there. So we have to realize what the time frame is for these solutions that we want to put in place, right? From beginning to solve that problem, and it's going to take a while. We meeting once a month, for example, can probably be not even a drop in that ocean, right? For to bring that level of awareness, but at least whoever we touch, whoever watches this, and whoever comes, in a conversation, brings a perspective. And I think that nature of all of us, that everybody in this group, across all the different groups that are associated with us, brings such fresh new perspective and their own biases that will help us learn about that other perspective which we don't have, right? That's fascinating. And I'm not very pessimistic about this thing, but I know this is one of the hardest problems to solve, and it's not easy. So whatever we can do by breaking it down and assigning some sort of a time frame and a plan around it is best case scenario that we can do right now. So yeah, that's.
Can I kind of recap on that though? Because there's two things that I always talk about pretty regularly, not just in the world of AI, but when I look at diversity and inclusion, when I look at sustainability, when I look at these big problems, because there's a lot of things going on in the world as a whole. And I think one thing he says, like, if you feel like it's an easy problem to solve, then you're not solving the right problem. And I think there's two things that I think I would ask anyone who's watching this program is, number one is to just really broaden our minds, to be more objective, right? We have to realize we don't know what we don't know. If we can carry that idea that we don't know what we don't know into every scenario that we look at least broaden our scope of vision as much as we can and try to be as holistic as possible, number one. Number two, with knowing that we don't know what we don't know, can we add a layer of responsibility? We don't need to have all of the answers, right? Like I look at, when I talk about diversity and inclusion, this idea of privilege. Well, who's privileged? Who's not privileged? How do you define privilege? Privilege is the idea of privilege is very neutral, right? Artificial intelligence is very neutral. It's what you do with that. But can we try to be as responsible in the development of what we're working on in that moment based off the data that we have? I think those are two things. If I could simplify maybe a couple actions, I think being more objective and trying to bring an air of responsibility into every project would be huge.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would just to stress on Vikram's point as well, and your point, Chris, is like, yeah, this might be only a 1 monthly meetup, but I do believe in the universal concept of ripple effect. Even if it's a drop in the ocean, but one drop could create, like, call it a wave that could go, I wouldn't say kilometers, miles away, even on the smaller level, until it reaches No, I'm talking about an ocean right now. It just goes
Yes,
like
okay.
this, and then it might hit somebody else and create another wave. So it might hit something in the ocean and create another one, which is that what I'm saying. The ripple effect. When people see that, maybe they should start talking about it. Maybe it will inspire them to start their own meetups, their own talks into that one, and um, um, everything you do is for good would have its impact on the universe. It doesn't matter how small we think it is. We're doing what we can do, and again, I believe in a wisdom. We say that in our culture in Arabic, that we will never reach perfection, but the wisdom of us trying to reach the perfection is sometimes the point. Like, we know we're not going to reach it, but we always try, and this is the wisdom of that. Trying to reach that perfection is the best we can do, and this is what we try. I think that concludes what I.
And we're making progress, at least, if nothing else.
Yes.
No argument there. Absolutely, the pursuit to be, towards that, being balanced, biased, making it a perfect world for everybody. Totally. No, I don't think there is anything that can be said beyond that.
We need more people to be part of the conversation is what we need, right? So if you're out there.
Yeah. So just wanted to quickly announce for the next month. So we have Shankar. I think some of us have met him, and he was part of ACLU, American Civil Liberty Union, and so he has fought many legislative battles and has got a lot of scars to show and share with us, and how we can sort of contribute, get involved. He's no longer with ACLU. There's another organization that he started, and I can find out. I mean, but we will definitely share the intro, the speaker bio soon, and so he's confirmed for the next event. His community is called Fair Tech for All. So he's a technical person, but also an attorney, and has fought many battles legislatively on behalf of ACLU. So we'll be hearing him as a speaker next time. So that would be in the September 3rd week.
That's amazing, because I always thought that the tech people are not talking to the legal people, and this is one of our biggest problems in creating legislations and speeding up the process of creating privacy laws and AI ethics laws and all. So finding someone, I'm looking really forward to see that. It's going to be really interesting.
Cool. Sangha, any final words before we wrap up?
Oh, no, this has been great. What also inspired me to close, I mean, as a closing statement, is I think it'll help us understand biases once we try to understand why are we like this? Why are humans like this? And that, I believe, simply stems from just how we've been through evolution for millions of years, which, I think universally we can accept that when we don't know something, we like to get into a fight, flight, or freeze mode. And that fear draws biases, and naturally that need for survival will always say, I'm more important and I'm better than that person, and I need to take all that person's resources. And that's what causes global problems today, as it always has for centuries. So like a habitual thing that would be the dream that could even bring world peace is when you look at something you don't know, don't try to blow it up. Yeah. Going forward.
Awesome.
That's a big ask. It's a bigger ask than AI turning general AI.
Anybody watching this show, please don't blow things up.
Yes. Stop, think, and be curious and be, welcoming. First, then attack if you have to. Yeah. Reverse.
Right. With that, that concludes today's panel, and we'll see everybody next month. Right? Thank you, everyone.
You got it. Thank you, gents.
Thank you.
Bye.